Why would Christians use jokes to make a point? And what might satire uniquely reveal about the human imagination? These questions and more we will explore on today's episode. This is Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven, and I am E. Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven. In this podcast, we find the best Christian-made fantasy, science fiction, and beyond, including often misunderstood genres like satire, and we apply these stories to the real world that our Creator and Savior, Jesus Christ, has called us to serve.
And this is episode 30. How can the Babylon Bee's satire reflect our crazy reality, with Frank Fleming? And I'm Zackary Russell, now a recognized contributor to the Babylon Bee. Yes, you heard that right. Earlier this week as we record this, I wrote a satirical headline that was chosen by the staff of the Babylon Bee. That was a really high point of this week. And one of the writers developed it into a full article, complete with an epic Photoshop. The title is, Brilliant Trump Puts Himself on All Postage Stamps, Forcing Democrats to Push for Abolishing the USPS.
Zach, I actually got to read this headline before it appeared on the site, and it appeared basically as you wrote it, despite my attempts over text messaging to say, oh, wait, it would be funnier if you said this, or it'd be funnier if you just ended it here. And then they just published it as is, in which case I had to sit down and be humble and realize that the masters who entered the house, they understood that this is funny as you wrote it.
Thanks. You know, Stephen, this all started out from something you had posted on Facebook about a week ago, where you said, I have no opinion about the post office kerfuffle going on right now in the news about this whole mail-in ballot, debate. So I credit you for thinking of this idea of like, well, okay, what's my take on mail-in ballots in the post office and all this stuff?
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, what I actually did understand, I do have an opinion on it now, but my post was more about everyone's rush to judgment. Oh, my stars. Bad leader X is going to destroy the post office and democracy has ended in America. And oh no, they're locking up the mailboxes and they're pulling them off the streets and we're all going to die. And some of that is just absolutely overwrought. And it's not just one particular side or political faction that is vulnerable to that kind of alarmism, understand. But in this case, I frankly lost respect for some of my friends who were jumping onto that, or at least jumping onto me when I said, okay, you all can have fun with this latest outrage du jour, but as for me and my house, I refuse to play the game. And everybody got mad at me. Oh, you're enabling him. Like, no, I'm busy. I am moving. I've got 2 teenagers in the house now. I've got a book coming out. I've got podcasts to outline.
I have a life.
I cannot join every single battle that everybody wants to fight, especially when it's based on memes and tweets and just everyone falling down and screaming like everything's on fire. Everything is on fire, but okay, in Christ, have some self-control.
And listener, if you want to know my opinion about this whole thing, personally, I'm fine with the post office ending because number one, I never have a good experience there. But number two, I welcome our drone delivery overlords for all things mail and packages. I think that would be an awesome future to live in.
You are part of the problem, Zach.
That's right. But yeah, I've been a subscriber to the Babylon Bee for a few months now, so I get to pitch headlines to them, and that's just been an awesome part of my day. Just great to think of like a miniature story by headline. So when I was thinking about a joke about this whole post office thing, I thought back to this Babylon Bee joke earlier this year. Now, okay, we're getting in the political realm here, just so you know, listener. We're not going to make this a political podcast, but earlier this year there was a joke where the Bee was talking about the impeachment hearings that were going on. And so they made this joke, in surprise move, Trump supports the impeachment, forcing Democrats to end it. And so it's this whole series of jokes they have about 4D chess or whatever. And so I just really love those because they're just so funny. It just kind of like makes fun of everything. And that was the case with this headline when I posted on Facebook and shared it with friends. It made both of my conservative and progressive friends laugh. Like, I think everyone could find something to laugh about in this article. Yeah, so let me just read one of the lines in here. It says, the new stamp, dubbed the Trump stamp, to be used on all pieces of mail, features a smiling Donald Trump with the caption, greatest president ever. And people react by saying, I will never send another piece of mail again. So just imagining just like a really absurd future of like, what if the president put himself on a stamp? Like, that would just be crazy. And with today's political climate, everyone would just burn all their stamps or something, like, who knows?
Honestly, though, it sounds like something he would do.
Right, exactly. Every person in this article and every way that everyone reacts, like at the end, it talks about the stamps quickly sell out and they're sold online for $3,000 a piece. It's like you could kind of see that happening too.
Is that the Steve Bannon selling them online for $3,000 a piece? That's a bit of a political deep cut there, folks.
Everyone kind of gets a little bit teased in this article. And as we record this, it has 923,000 shares. So we're closing in on 1 million shares with this article. So it's still like the top, the number one trending article on their site right now, which is really fun.
Babylon Bee subscriber Zackary Russell contributed to this report.
So we're mentioning this because we've invited the Babylon Bee's senior writer, Frank J. Fleming, to come on the podcast today. And I'll be talking with Frank about the role of satire and speculative fiction for communicating hilarious truth about the real world. But first, before we jump into that, Stephen, what are some other funny articles from the Bee that you've loved?
Well, I don't mind the political ones. I know that there are many critics of, the Babylon Bee has gone political. And a lot of that, I think, is unfortunately based on the fact that Babylon Bee articles making fun of leftists are very popular among those types of conservative Trump-supporting relatives that some younger Christians just can't stand. So, alas, there's a bit of a guilt by association thing going on there. Aunt Marge from the church back home shared this article and thought it was real. So therefore, there must be something wrong with the Babylon Bee. There's almost a bit of almost a legalism that can set in there. Suddenly the genre of satire is suspect because silly Aunt Marge takes it too seriously. I myself think that is unnecessary to throw the Babylon Bee out with the bathwater. I think that you can critique Aunt Marge and people who don't get satire while still appreciating satire, even the stuff that seems a little partisan in the direction of the right or in favor of the right. Because after all, they do criticize the left and the right too. Probably not equally. They do know their audience. But my favorite articles, though, have to be the ones that gently, affectionately lampoon Christians or Christian subculture. That's kind of how they started. Like even the name of the site is kind of a reference to a very famous biblical city, not known for being a very nice place. And the Bee, of course, being a reference to the sharp sting of satire or being spoofed or roasted. I like the ones about the Holy Spirit isn't allowed in church because the fog machine breaks, or in particular the ones about the gritty reboot of Bible Man, or I think my all-time favorite, but especially because it's a bit of a double inside joke, because one of the Babylon Bee writers, Ethan Nicole, who also created the webcomic phenomenon Axe Cop, so I knew him from that. He's now with the Babylon Bee, but in between he actually worked on the much
the VeggieTales.
VeggieTales Netflixed, which some people were not fans of, particularly because the character redesign. So he actually took an image of the character redesigns, and then they had a story saying that it was a marijuana plant character that they said was going to join VeggieTales, and he photoshopped it. I think it was him who photoshopped it, and it looked perfectly at home amongst the new versions of the veggies. Just with this dopey, obviously stoned looking expression on his face, and the eyebrows and everything matched. And he had chosen a shot from the VeggieTales Netflix reboot version where they were all just looking at him in shock and surprise, shocked and slightly embarrassed at the sight of the marijuana character. I think that's my favorite because I would just stare at the photo, not just the photo, y'all. Babylon Bee folks, we don't just read the headlines. We do click and we read the whole story most of the time. We don't just look at the pretty pictures either. But I think that one is just hilarious because it's just absurdism. It doesn't even really make fun of Christians or subculture or VeggieTales. It's just a reductio ad absurdum, and I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I love just the totally zany ones they come up with, especially that deal with just normal life, like family life or church life. There's this one, Naomi and I quote this one all the time, where it says, "Mother returns home from women's retreat to giant smoking crater." And in the article, the mom says, "I only requested 2 things, keep the kids alive and don't burn the house down. Just 2 things." So anytime Naomi goes anywhere, like we always joke about that. Like, am I going to come home to a giant smoking crater on the ground? So that one's great. But at my church, I serve as the tech guy. Like I'm the one of the production guys that handles all the AV stuff. Oh my gosh, they have so many great ones. Like I feel seen, by some of these headlines about the church tech guy, and probably the best one ever. And this is way back from 2016. The headline is "Church Tech Guy Completes Historic Perfect Service." And it's just so great because no one notices when the service runs well. You only notice when like a slide is out of place or a word is misspelled or whatever. You get off track. In the article, it says like the crowd erupts in applause, like which that would never happen. I just love it. It's so crazy.
So it's a bit of a niche joke, particularly for those who have handled the slideshows or the audio for a church service, but it helps us, and I think that's a good role of satire at its best. It helps us to see we're not making fun of the church or making fun of the sound guy, but we're looking at a mirror that reflects ourselves back to us. And just like you explained, and that's the danger in possibly over-explaining the joke, but it helps particularly for folks who don't get satire or don't get the purpose of satire or suspect it somehow. It helps us to see, wait a minute, like we really don't appreciate the sound guy. Like we always notice, like you said, when something goes wrong, but when something goes right, we just assume that is baseline expectation. And so that helps me then to look not at someone else, bad politician X or stupid Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and instead I'm looking at myself, which is a far more biblical posture of humility, of laughing not at someone else in a bad-natured way, but laughing at myself. And even those little ways, maybe they're not sinful, but I would say that it's a bit of a shortcoming. Like I don't appreciate the sound guy. I don't appreciate this person or that person or the mom who holds everything together or any of those folks.
Yeah, well, and I even love how a lot of their humor touches on theology and just really crazy ways. Like there's another tech guy one where the headline is "Calvinist Tech Guy Assures Church His Mistakes Were Ordained Before the Foundation of the World."
Hey, where's the lie, though? Where's the lie? Also, there's plenty of the fantastical edge in Babylon Bee headlines as well. When they touch on Middle Earth or Narnia or any of the other fandoms, they have plenty of jokes, for example, about Christians who are overly concerned about the Harry Potter series or things like that. Mm-hmm. From what I've seen, they always get their references fairly right. They will hyphenate Spider-Man. They had a story recently about DC rebrands woman as a wonder person with a certain an anatomical component based on this weird CNN headline that refused to say the word women. Stuff like that, to me, as a fan and as a fantastical story creator and fan of those, I appreciate that attention to detail. And it also helps to place this topic firmly in the realm of the fantastical. This is a side of those genres, a subgenre with lots of overlap that we can do well to explore.
Yeah, and it's helped me in a lot of ways, just kind of take a break a little bit, or sort of loosen my grip on some certain pop cultural, I'll dare say, idols that I hold. So I grew up as a Star Wars kid, and when the Disney sequels came out, man, I had a lot of I had a lot of things I did not like about them. And I can't find the headline, but there was one Babylon Bee headline about how we're all just arguing about space wizards with colorful laser swords or whatever. It's like, we're arguing about how could that possibly happen? When we're talking about a fantastical story, it's just great. Like I think about that one all the time, that like, okay, I need to just relax about everything I get too hot and bothered about with Star Wars. But, for you, our listener, we'd love to know, what's your favorite Babylon Bee headline? What's one that you think about all the time? So send us a note, podcast@lorehaven.com. Let us know what you think about that. We're about to go into the interview with Frank. Before we do that, why don't we hear from our sponsor?
Absolutely. We have another sponsor for this Fantastical Truth episode. And this episode is sponsored by author J.J. Johnson. He just released his fantasy novel, A King's Return. You need to go to the show notes and look at this, if not for the premise, but also because it has an amazing cover. I'm not sure who the cover designer is, but we really do need to give them props. And that's not something the sponsorship text told me to say. That's something I decided I was going to say. This is the description of A King's Return by J.J. Johnson. Quote, "Islandia has been without a high king for a generation. Eloi, the last High King, embarked upon a journey shrouded in mystery after a cryptic warning found from a long-lost prophet promised a return of ancient dark forces. Eloi had placed the rule of Islandia and the Five Kingdoms in the hands of his closest friend, King Richard. After 30 years, most have long since stopped looking for Eloi's return or the darkness foretold. Many under Richard's rule have grown discontent and jealous of his appointment. All hope for peace is lost and chaos reigns after the icy hand of an assassin takes the life of King Richard and plucks him from the throne. What now? Will Prince Titus, Richard's son, have the strength to hold Islandia together, or will it descend into war over the High King's throne? The kingdom is divided by the sword, as each must decide where their loyalties lie. End quote. And you can go to our show notes where we will have the link to the Amazon page for this book and that great cover. And you can explore more of J.J. Johnson's world at kingdomsofislandia.com. That's Islandia, like island with an I-A at the end. Get all of those links in the show notes. And we appreciate that sponsorship from J.J. Johnson for this fantasy novel, A King's Return. Now let's head into that one-on-one interview with Zach here and Frank Fleming of the Babylon Bee fame and a sci-fi writer in his own right.
Frank J. Fleming is the author of science fiction, fantasy, and satire. A senior writer for the Babylon Bee, he's known for hard-hitting stories like really interesting theological discussion ruined by someone pulling out a Bible verse, and engineer frustrated at inability to tell responsible citizens from train robbers, as well as report the squirrels are up to something. And if you follow the Babylon Bee podcast, you know that Frank is the voice of most of the Trump jokes. Frank started out blogging political commentary on imao.us, which stands for In My Arrogant Opinion, which is a brilliant title. His political satire was featured on the New York Post. He says he wrote satire because it didn't require any research. He could just make stuff up. In 2016, and he got sick of politics like the rest of us. Now he's focused on writing speculative fiction. The best part about sci-fi and fantasy is he can just once again make stuff up and not have to do any research. Frank and his wife Sarah are raising 4 children near Central Texas. Frank, welcome to Fantastical Truth.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so here's kind of our evergreen question. How did you first discover Christian truth and fantastical fiction? So how did you learn about the Christian faith, and then how did you first discover a fantastical story?
First one's a little bit easier. I was raised Catholic, pretty much a practicing Catholic. I met who would be my wife. She first brought me to Church of Christ, and then I started to question a bit some of the Catholic teachings. About that same time, let's see, it was 2005. Pope John Paul II died, and then I just questioned a bit more, and just some things didn't seem to line up to me with Catholic Church versus the Bible. And so then I got baptized that year at a little church in Florida. You know, it's not like wasn't a believer and was a believer. It's just part of the journey there, though it just took a different path. For sci-fi fantasy, when I first got into that, I mean, that seems to go back even further. I used to read a lot as a real little kid, and then for some reason I stopped. I remember like Dragonlance. Read a lot as a little kid, and then some reason I stopped as much in high school, and I had to come back to it later. But I've always wanted to create even more than read. But as always hear a lot of people say, you have to read a lot if you want to write well, and so I do. I read a wide variety now and try to constantly be reading.
Nice. And do you remember like the first Christian fantastical story you read?
It's funny. I read a Canticle for Leibowitz, which was a very Catholic one, but it was interesting to see the mix of sort of religious faith and science fiction. And I'm trying to think. I don't think a lot of what I read was as Christian focused, but when you don't have characters, you don't think of eternal things, of religion. I don't relate to them as well, and so I'd like to see more characters like that.
Well, that's cool. Well, let's jump into our main topic about the Babylon Bee. So I remember first discovering the Bee when it was under Adam Ford. It was a lot better back then, like everyone says, right?
Yeah, everybody misses Adam Ford.
But I remember thinking, wow, a Christian version of The Onion. And, you know, and that's kind of a funny thought, by the way. I feel like we do that a lot as Christians, like, hey, it's a Christian version of this or that. And now we have a Christian version of Kanye West.
Yeah. They did a joke recently, like, if you like this, and then here's the lame Christian version. Of course, the last one was, if you like The Onion, try the Babylon Bee.
But it's funny because I always loved The Onion, and I'm more conservative, but the Onion leans more liberal.
Mhm.
But I've always enjoyed it because the jokes were good, and even when they challenged my own views, I still enjoyed it. As one example, there was this article. It was some tragic mass shooting had happened. Okay, and then there was talk in the political leaders about having a gun ban or something, and then gun sales started skyrocketing because of that. So the Onion put out this article. Oh, after devastating guerrilla attack, nation sees shortage of attack gorillas after record sales of gorillas or something.
Yeah.
I think about that a lot. If nothing else, it's kind of a silly story.
Yeah. And that's where I think that's an influence to my satirical writing. Is my favorite Onion ones are not the political ones, but the absurdist ones. And
Right.
And then so I try to, because to me, writing political humor for an audience that agrees with you, it's sort of like writing humor with easy mode on, because because they agree with you, they'll give it to you even if it wasn't that clever or that funny. So I'd like to write things a bit more challenging than that. I think a lot of times if you write politically, it just kind of says, "Oh, what you already believe, you're really smart to believe, and people who don't believe that, they're dumb." I don't think that's as helpful, even though that's what a lot of it ends up as.
Yeah, and so I like how the bee has become much more than that. Just kind of makes fun of everything and everyone. I think where I first saw that in action was, I don't know if this was a series or it was just kind of I pieced it together in my mind, but there were all these articles about different worship styles in Protestant churches. And so there was one about Pentecostal church having the laser show is broken, so they have to cancel service, and then another one, the fog machine breaks, so the Holy Spirit can't come in. And
That's Kyle Mann, who's now the the head the main writer. That was his very first article.
okay, yeah, and then another one was a water slide put in. I forget whose church that was, and then I think it was Presbyterian church. The motion detecting lights turn off during worship, and so it just takes no prisoners, basically, but in a kind way, not a mean way.
Yeah, I think what attracts a lot of people, that's how I first noticed the Babylon Bee, is the humor on those very specific Christian topics where you're not going to find that at the Onion because it's too Christian specific. It's a lot of it's not not going to go to a broad audience. That's kind of a challenge with it. Those are, I think, what kind of give us what make Babylon Bee unique, but it's the political ones that tend to go viral and really take off.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, I learned recently that there have been some Babylon Bee articles that had more web traffic than CNN.
Yeah, we're surprised sometimes. I didn't realize how well the site competed with all the big names, and and traffic's been growing for a while. I think we, like everybody, we kind of got a hit with COVID, just because I don't know if that changes people's reading habits when they're not in the office or something.
So what do you think makes the satire of the Babylon Bee work? Why do satire? Why are people attracted to that?
Well, I mean, some of it is we're hitting from a different angle you're not going to get at other places. That's something that's going to appeal to some people, is having a different political angle. And then I think other is just the Christian's perspective, where we have nice niche humor that you're not going to get anywhere else. We have a nicer edge. I mean, there's a few things we'll really pull out the knives for, but it's I like to think it's more good natured. I'm not trying to shock you or anything. And and it's harder to pull that off and do good humor. It's easier to do the shocking humor and get it laughed that way.
Hmm. I mean, it would be easy just to make worship leaders skinny jean jokes forever, but I guess you can only do so many of those.
Yeah. And that's sort of the problem. And sometimes you wonder, like, it always feels like you ran out of jokes on a certain topic, but you got to keep hitting at it. And we put out, I don't know how many. It's like 5 or 6 articles a day. Usually about half of those are Kyle. He is kind of a machine on that. But now we have a decent number of other regular writers, so we do keep the articles coming.
And so how many do you write a week on average?
Usually 5. I usually write one each weekday.
I know there's some issues that you say you really bring the knives out for, some
Mhm.
topics you guys really care about. So why not just publish that as like an op-ed? Why tell it slant, as Emily Dickinson famously said in her poem about that. Why use satire?
I think because it's more entertaining, people are a little bit tired of just getting lectured at, and it's just how do you come at it a way that's at least people actually read it and pay attention. And I think satire does that right now. It's just culturally we're more sarcastic people now.
For me, the role of humor is that it kind of makes life more interesting, and especially in 2020, like it's been a pretty terrible year. It helps us kind of see things clearer. I think sometimes too that I think I've heard Kyle Mann mention before that when you tell a joke, you can get straight to the point. You don't have to couch it in a lot of disclaimers. You don't have to say, well, I'm not saying this and I'm not saying that. You can just go straight to the punch, right?
Yeah, and usually to get the joke, you really have to analyze things well, try to get to the core of it, like why are people arguing over this? And if, you have to search basically the core truth, and then that's where the good joke is. You help people realize, maybe what's beneath everything.
So we live kind of in a hypersensitive time, right? and everything is at risk of getting canceled at any time. So do you take that into consideration when writing jokes? Like, how do you deal with that?
We try not to because we don't want to be a part of that. We're not ones trying to push the envelope either. We're not trying to shock people. But at the same time, we don't want to be part of this where it's like everybody has to walk on eggshells and feel scared to say what they believe. But we're in a pretty good position. Our big fear sometimes is if like one of big platforms turned against us. But because of subscribers, we can stay afloat just on that. So that's why actually the subscriptions have been an important part of making the Babylon Bee feel secure and not have to worry too much.
I think so much of what's going on with pushback I've seen personally on the Babylon Bee, even from people I know, is that sometimes it gets kind of close to home. Like that Onion joke about the attack gorillas selling out. That kind of hits close to home here in Texas, where everyone has like 3 or 4 guns apiece.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, don't take away my attack gorilla, man. I need that to fight all the other attack gorillas. But and that, definitely mocked part of my culture as a Texan. And so I think sometimes with satire, with humor, people feel like they're being mocked. And there's this great C.S. Lewis quote at the beginning of Screwtape Letters where he says, above all else, the devil cannot stand to be mocked. The devil is so proud that he can't handle any jokes about himself. But I really think being able to laugh at yourself is such an underrated skill nowadays. And even if it's someone else that's starting the joke about you, I think you have to kind of laugh along with it, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that's where actually we can provide a benefit is everybody's so serious right now. You hear all these people talk about like how horrible things are when it's like, I don't feel like people have perspective, and it's nice to kind of take a light approach to all these things going on because nothing really is the end of the world. Nothing here is going to really harm us, and we have to keep a perspective. I think it's very important, certainly for Christians, to not despair, and I think keeping a sense of humor is a good part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's even a role for kind of dark humor, gallows humor. I've been through some pretty traumatizing things in my life where humor is kind of how I joke about it, but it's not always for everyone. One thing I joked about in a Facebook group was about, so I'm diabetic, and I made a joke about that, and someone else was like, oh, my father passed away from diabetes, and so I don't think that's very funny. And so I had to kind of think for a second, well, okay, that joke wasn't for that person, but it was for me. And I just had to say, well, I'm sorry that rubbed you the wrong way. I wasn't obviously thinking of your father because I didn't even know about that person before I made that joke. But the interesting thing was, as I talked to that person, we were able to kind of see each other a little more clearly. And she saw how, for me, that's how I get through something as awful as a disease, like a chronic disease. I just have to make fun of it. And even just make fun of myself a little bit, because you can't get through life if you take yourself too seriously. Something else I know you've said elsewhere, Frank, is that having jokes about politicians and politics, that helps us be a little more discerning, doesn't it? And be a little more skeptical about politicians.
Yeah, I wish everybody could just come together and say, hey, let's be skeptical about all these guys. But instead, it's usually like, this guy's bad, but and then you got to prop up this other guy in response. Get a bit frustrated about the DNC thing right now, where everybody's trying to. For a while, pretty much everybody ridiculed Biden, and now you got a good segment trying to say, "Oh, like, oh wow, look at him give this speech," which is like, it's like any politician, can have someone write a speech and read it. It doesn't mean anything, and we need to take all these people off of a pedestal, not just some of them.
Yeah, well, it was so that kind of leads us to the other thing that happened this week, which is the Twitter apocalypse of satire. So the Babylon Bee and some other satirical accounts like Titania McGrath, Jarvis DuPont, and The Onion, actually just kidding, not The Onion, but all these accounts were suspended from Twitter. So that was a kind of a fascinating thing to watch. Well, so the funny thing is you and I have talked elsewhere that this happened right when the headline that I wrote for the Bee got published. And I don't know which came first, the Twitter ban or that article, but it was just interesting that happened at the same time.
Yeah, just as it went up, but that one actually did really, really well. I think it probably got more viewership because it happened. We got a ton of publicity for it. So.
And it's kind of one of those things, no publicity is bad publicity, because I think it was the Babylon Bee itself was trending on Twitter shortly after that.
Yeah, because that was a pretty blatant thing where it's like, obviously, these guys aren't spam. And that's one of the things that frustrated me when people get banned on Twitter is they're kind of inscrutable exactly what they're complaining about. They'll just say, like, here's a link to a giant list of things you can get banned for. What you did is somewhere on there. And, and so we're trying to figure out what's going on. And they said something about, like, the email was like spam or something. Now, they just later said it was just an algorithm mishap and we didn't do anything wrong, but it only I forgot how long it wasn't that long we were banned, but it got quite a bit of publicity because if that happens to any other news platforms or something, I mean that's a big deal.
Well, and like I said, with those other accounts that got banned, those are not right-wing accounts, although they kind of make fun of the same things, like some of the identity politics stuff. Andrew Doyle, who is the actual writer of the satirical Titania McGrath, he really made a lot of noise about this, and he had an interesting quote where he said, "Only a tyrant executes the court jester."
Yeah.
And it's even that is kind of hyperbole, because it's like, well, okay, it's just Twitter, but that is kind of the marketplace of ideas now. It's where everyone goes to have an argument or whatever.
Now, I think what happened with him was a little bit different. I don't know if they claim that was just a mishap or what. But we've had people try to say we're more sinister, like call us satire in quotes, like we're trying to trick people. Because we've had articles that have, gotten spread where people didn't realize they were satire. It's funny, though, some of our most widely spread ones, though, were spread by the left. We had one where it's right after, I forget, it was like Trump got criticized Christianity Today and said how much he'd done done more for Christians than any other president. We instead wrote an article where he said Trump saying, "I've done more for Christianity than Jesus," and that got spread as it didn't do that great as because of our audience. Sometimes when we go after Trump, it doesn't always go as well if it's very pointed at him. But then it got picked up by people on the left who thought it was real, and that one got just tons of traffic. And we had another where I think it was Liberty University saying they put in a nice Photoshop of him putting in a stained glass window of Trump. And that one got shared as real as well.
I remember the Photoshop on that one. That was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And I love the Photoshop that I assume Ethan did for the headline I wrote about the Trump stamp. That was just like, I could see it in my head as I was writing that headline. I'm like, oh man, if this gets picked up, that the Photoshop's going to be incredible.
Yeah, but there's been implications that we're trying to make people angry on the right by being fake news, where they can't, where we're not, where they
right.
we're not trying to trick people, where they don't know that we're satire, and it's just kind of crazy. I saw this whole study they did where they took a number of our headlines, but they changed them around so they weren't funny sounding, and they just asked people, "Do you think this is real or not?" It was so bizarre.
That is weird. It's
a
weird way to do it. Yeah, well, you said something earlier about how when we make these jokes about politicians, the value is that it kind of helps us come together and take these leaders off of their pedestals and just say, hey, can we just be on the same page for a minute? And that politics is kind of silly and it's kind of crazy. And The best thing about that article, or well, someone else wrote the article. I just wrote the headline about the Trump stamp. The best part about that was I have family members that are pro-Trump and family members that are anti-Trump, and they both laughed at it. There was something in that article that everyone could kind of enjoy. Just imagining Trump putting himself on a stamp, like that's pretty hilarious. Or imagining people burning down the post office because of that.
Yeah, I have to congratulate you, because that's the sweet spot we aim for, is one where it's like, not sure if we're making fun of Trump or we're laughing with Trump, and then you can get it shared by both people on the right and left, and that's always nice when you write something everybody can enjoy.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, it kind of hits that spot of absurdist, like, wait, that would never happen. Wait, could that happen? And that's kind of the fun thing about satire, is it's its own variety of speculative fiction, right? It's like this alternative reality simulation. Like, what if this actually happened? What would happen next? And so it's kind of a fun way to just explore fantastical stories in its own way.
Yeah, and that's, to me, I found a big part of writing humor, especially when I first did like some radio and stuff. I was never felt like I was very good as just talking about like, oh, here's some funny stuff I wrote. But I found it was much easier if I was playing a character, because then I'm not thinking what's something funny. I'm thinking, if I actually believe like this, what would I say in this situation? It's actually an easier question to answer, and usually leads to a lot of humor.
Well, let's talk about your sci-fi character, Rico Vargas.
He's really just Rico. The Vargas is just a fake last name he uses a lot.
Oh, nice. So he's the main character of the Super Ego series. There's 2 books out now, and it's the summary of this book is: can a genetically engineered psychopath grow a conscience, get the girl, and save the galaxy? 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So we've got a story about an intergalactic hitman with no morality. And so, you talked about playing characters. So is this an autobiography, Frank? Is there something something of you in this character?
Well, I think everybody has a little bit of a psychopath in them. They can understand where they just want to turn things off and not, and we all have that urge to just like, let's not care about this other people's feelings and things like that. And so it's tapping a bit into that. I think the main concept for me was coming up with basically contrived science fiction character where morality has absolutely no use for him in any way whatsoever. He doesn't worry about consequences from the law. He has no conscience, so if he does something bad, he doesn't get a bad feeling for it. And so he's definitely a nihilist, and then it's just, well, make a character like that. Well, what does motivate him? What does he try to do? What does he live for? And, what problems is he going to run into? And that was basically the concept for the character. And I remember I started out as like a short story to back on my blog back in 2005, and at the time I think I was watching. Feel bad, I was more like TV influenced than book influenced. I was watching like 24 and House. And in ways, those were influences, because House is a cranky guy, just says what he thinks, and you can have fun with that. Who doesn't really care, how that affects other people. And then just like 24, where just you're constantly ending things on some big cliffhanger. And since I was writing it a piece at a time, the short story, I kind of emulated that. Though when I did do a full size novel, I completely rewrote it from the ground up.
Yeah, it's been quite the page turner. I'm in the middle of the book now. It's been really fun, and it's funny. Like there's so many lines I've highlighted just because they made me laugh. So I like that this is a sci-fi action adventure, but it's not simply John Wick in space. It's got a lot of heart to it. The main character kind of reminds me a little bit of Dexter, that TV series. That it's this person trying to become normal or trying to appear normal. Like something's different about him, but he's trying to kind of fit in.
Yeah, it's funny because, like I said, I first wrote 2005. I forget when Dexter came out. It was a little bit after that. When I watched the first season, I was like, oh man, I totally copied this. Because there was a lot similar, except Dexter's a serial killer. He has a need to kill. Rico doesn't have a need to kill. He just doesn't care, and it's something he's good at.
Yeah, but even just that struggle of trying to find a morality, or at least trying to fit in with the human world. This is obviously an extreme version of that, but I think everyone can kind of relate to that. It's a universal desire to not be an outcast. Rico's doing it for his job as a hitman, but all of us kind of hit that point where we feel like, so something's a little different about me. I better try to figure out what I need to do to fit in with this group, right?
Yeah, and I explore that a bit in the sequel, and also there's a prequel short story. I think you can read off my website, and I explore that a bit more. Where to him, it's like he has a lot of problems around people. It's frustrating for him, but at the same time, something he hasn't quite realized though is that he's lonely, and I think that's the way all people need to be connect with other people, even a psychopath.
Now, I like how you have him get introduced to this woman, Diane, who's a cop, and how he has no use for religion. He's not totally against it, but he kind of makes fun of it. But it seems to kind of touch a nerve with her, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's the thing. He's a very nihilistic atheist, and so anyone who's not nihilistic, he kind of looks down on. To him, it's like the average atheist is still kind of religious to him because they believe there's some reason to go on and do the things they do, and he finds it all, rather pointless. In a way, like say, a bit of respect for religion. At least they understand more their irrational beliefs, or at least more cognizant of them.
Yeah, and then she's a character that wants to do the right thing, but kind of struggles with kind of her own inner demons, and so Rico kind of finds that confusing in a way. It's like, well, why don't you just beat this guy up or shoot that guy? Like, what's the big deal? Like, why are you getting kind of in twists about it? But I love the lines in here. Like, I liked her. She seemed pretty smart. Hopefully not so smart. I'd have to kill her. And then his AI assistant asks him, "Do you plan to kill her?" Well, that would be a little forward for a first date. So, Frank, this is definitely my type of humor, just this dark humor. It's very snarky and kind of sarcastic, but it's enjoyable. And it kind of draws you in. It disarms you a little bit. You kind of sneak in some of these bigger questions about what is it that makes us human? What does it mean to have a soul? And so I like that you don't front load that. You just sort of sprinkle it throughout the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the main reasons to write fiction is because I want to write about bigger things than politics, and so it's kind of a way to explore some bigger ideas. It is a bit like some of the humor is a bit dark. It almost surprised me. It's like that my first novel is like first person from a psychopath, since I tend to do lighter, more fun humor, which you'd see in my other novels. But people have fun with it. I mean, that's one thing I was surprised by the reaction. This was my first attempt of doing like something long that was serious, but the main reaction I get is like how funny it is.
Yeah, and there's a second book out, Super Ego Fathom, which, as I understand it, it's all about indoctrinating readers into your views on tax policy. Is that correct?
Well, that was a joke on off of I wrote for Sarah Hoyt's blog, like how to indoctrinate people. But it's me when I write something. I mean, the main thing is it needs to be fun. I mean, the main thing I'm aiming for is a page turner, especially with a Super Ego Fathom. I was trying to really get that where it's like every grips you and pulls you through, and you have to finish one chapter, you're compelled to start the next one. You put a theme on top of that, but I think the main thing is I really like a plot driven story, and then like I said, a fun dialogue. I really love writing dialogue. It takes me a lot of discipline to just not write a bunch of dialogue with like very little description.
Now, Super Ego Fathom, it's still about Rico. It's his story, but it sort of shifts, right? In that he's trying to be a hero, but he doesn't have kind of an inner sense of what heroism is or what morality is, like, because it was genetically engineered out of him. So how does he go about that?
Well, yeah, it's exploring his attempt as idea of what it means to be a hero, but and whether it will do anything for him because he has the same. Okay, if he's a villain, he doesn't care. It doesn't mean anything to him. But if he's a hero, he also doesn't care. I mean, saving people means nothing to him. But he's trying after the end of the first book to like do something different and see if it accomplishes anything.
This touches on a lot of things that I think about, just this idea of how do you follow the right way, even if you don't feel like going that way. And I have a very good friend from college that we talked about the Christian faith and the Bible all the time. But he would just say, at the end of the day, I don't feel like God exists. Like, I don't feel anything inside of me that tells me it's true. If I could just experience something, supernatural, I would probably believe in it. But I'm really lacking that kind of inner sense of that it's real. And as we got to talking more, I said, "Well, what is it you want to feel?" And he's like, "Well, I'd want to feel that if God really loves me, that I would kind of feel that love." And as we talk further, he's like, I never heard my father say, "I love you."
Oh, wow.
And I thought, wow, well, there we go. Just that kind of vacuum inside of him, it sort of closed off that feeling, perhaps. So I like that super ego and in the follow up kind of addresses that hey, maybe we all have something a little bit sideways in us, a little bit broken, but God calls us out of that into something amazing and supernatural, but maybe we can't, always relate to it like other people can. Like you see these people that have these very clear sense of what God wants them to do in their life, and other people are like, I just read the Bible and I just try to make sense of it, but I don't always feel the right way to go.
Yeah, I think I get in that bit with Rico because I mean, for his perspective, I mean, he's a nihilist. Everything's just this abyss to him, and what happens? Not to get too much spoilers. The first book, it's almost like his whole life. It's just been this big black void, and then there's just one little like match was lit once, and he saw it for an instant, and now he's just like, is there something more? But he has much less feeling of like the divine than like anyone else. Because it's interesting you say, like, to me, I don't think something supernatural would convince me. A lot of people think about that, like if you saw some big miracle. But I always think of like Peter from the Bible, all the people who were directly with Jesus and they saw all the miracles and they still doubted. It's not what we see, I think, with our eyes that really convince us. It's something you have to find the things that's inside of what you see every day.
Mhm.
That's also something I'd say I explore very much in my novel Side Quest.
Yeah, so tell us about that. I haven't read that yet, but I understand that's more in the fantasy genre.
Yeah, that it's maybe say urban fantasy. I'd say in a way it's my more Christian novel, though it doesn't mention God or Jesus or anything even once in it. It's what it is. The main character, he just on the way to work on normally he's a just programmer, finds a sword in a field given to him by fairies, and then he starts to notice weird things like his boss is a demon, realizes his girlfriend works for like this evil force and stuff. And it's not that he's the only one who notices it. It's just he's the only one who thinks any of this is outlandish. And it's just you start to realize all these weird things in the world that no one else thinks is even interesting to note. I had a lot of fun with that one, but it's very much to me a self-contained novel. I don't think I plan to do a sequel to that one.
Yeah, I see a lot of echoes of that in the Christian experience, in that you learn a lot of new things about the world that you didn't see before, you had Christ in your life. And I remember going through that very clearly in college and just sort of having this almost like a deprogramming experience of things I had come to believe because of secular culture, the things that I just always took for granted. But I was a very young Christian in college, and so as I start to study the Bible, I'm like, wow, life is a lot different than I thought it was, but now it's making a lot more sense. And so it, it's interesting how you said that this is like a Christian novel without being overtly Christian, but it definitely touches on at least that experience. Does it kind of reflect anything else in the Christian experience?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, that's part of the idea is that we're constantly surrounded by the fantastic, and it's just we don't notice it. I think you see this a lot, especially when you have children. You see a little kid how they just look at absolutely everything with such wonder and awe, and
Yeah.
the reason they do is because they see the world more honestly, more clearly than us. It's not, and eventually we just learn to not notice things as much, and we kind of close and make our world more narrow. And I think it's important sometimes to just really see what's around you and all the miracles in your life every day. And there's like you're surrounded by them, but you cut yourself off from them, and that's especially like all the people talk about like how horrible things are and how much they despair. It's just that they're not, they're choosing their focus on these few negative things and just ignoring all the wonderful things in their life.
Well, Frank, I know you said elsewhere that what made you want to walk away from full-time political commentary was the realization that there are more important things in life than politics, like your family. So we want to hear about your family in just a moment. But tell us about some of the early writing that you did in this kind of political space. I understand you had a book called Punch Your Inner Hippie. So is that where having an inner psychopath hitman comes in handy?
Well, that was like a joke self-help book where it was like here's how to, like, everybody has this hippie inside them and you got to learn how to punch that hippie. But I think I had some good points in that because I mentioned about I think I had like tank of awesomeness you have to build, and one was like armor of the tank is your gratitude, where it's like, you have to learn, to like the things you're given and not just complain all the time, because of course hippies whine all the time. And so to fight that, you have to learn to be thankful for all the things in your life. Just imagine if anytime you're about to complain about something, imagine explaining it to like a caveman, and think if they would think like, oh, I can't find the charger on my phone. It's like, would that be something they would think was like an actual problem?
Oh, that's so true. And I saw one of your earliest works in this political space was all the way back in 2002, called A Realistic Plan for World Peace, aka Nuke the Moon. So I like that there's a little bit of sci-fi there, a little bit of politics. Like, tell us about that.
Yeah, that was my first piece I wrote on my blog that took off, and I still a lot of people know me as the Nuke the Moon guy. Um, but it's a well set out plan. I almost feel like Trump is actually putting it into place. The idea is if you act really crazy, then people are going to leave you alone. And so that's my plan for world peace. It's like we got all these nukes sitting around, we're not doing anything with them. What's something we can nuke that wouldn't kill anybody or hurt anybody, but could intimidate the enemy? And so I said, like, you nuke the moon. It's very. And I found out later they actually had some plans to do that in the 50s.
Oh wow. Yeah, well, now we have a space force, so maybe we'll see it happen.
Yeah,
I certainly hope so.
We'll soon be able to actually implement it. And also, I said, like, we have all these national parks that most of them no one bothers with. We can nuke one of them, because if like people are like, oh, they'll even nuke themselves, think nothing of us.
Well, I'm very familiar with what you've said about how politics can just be a drag on the soul, and at some point you just have to realize, hey, it's not the most important thing in life. There are more important things like family. And so tell us about your family. You're a father of four, and you guys are homeschoolers, which we're very friendly towards homeschoolers here on this podcast. So tell us about your family.
Well, I have 4 kids. See, when a girl, boy. My oldest is she'll turn 10 in October. It'll be a decade of being a parent. And then my youngest, he's only 18 months. And we've been homeschooling for we've been homeschooling since they've been schooling. My wife's plan is always to do that, and I just feel lucky I've been able to we've been able to arrange that, because it's not always an option for every parent. Though I now a lot more, I guess, are having to figure out a way to make it happen, because it's just the school situation's gotten so crazy lately.
And as I understand it, your youngest son, Winchester, has Down syndrome.
Yes, he that was a little bit of a surprise for us. Well, because we didn't do the genetic test. We had a bad experience that they have like this blood test now where about like 12 weeks does like a genetic test. And one thing is you can find out the gender like much earlier now at 12 weeks. That came out, I think, before our first 2 children. Like, we didn't have it with our oldest, but we found with our second, we're having a boy through that test. But with our third child, we found she's a girl on that test. It also said she had trisomy 13, which is a very extreme disorder. Most likely she had that. She wouldn't live past a year. And that was a really tough thing to have hanging over you on a pregnancy. That's one of those where it's like, well, we would have loved, trisomy 21, Down syndrome, instead of that. But luckily it ended up being a false positive. And though we decided, since, we were just getting it for gender, really, is all we wanted to, a little bit earlier. We decided just to not do that test with our fourth one. So that's when it was a bit of a surprise when he was born. We found out he had Down syndrome. But at the same time, by not taking the test, we kind of acknowledged, that anything could happen. So it was like a surprise, but not, I guess. It hit me real quick because I wasn't prepared for it for like a few seconds. Like, oh, this could change all my future plans. And I realized, oh yeah, I don't have any future plans other than provide for my kids. And my wife did seem to phase her for a moment where the doctor went over to her and said, we think your son has Down syndrome. He says, okay, can I hold him? He's like, oh, I just want to make sure you heard me. I kind of dropped a bomb on you. He's like, yeah, I got it. Can I hold him? And so, but it's a little bit different. It's just, but right now he's just a baby and it doesn't really seem as real. I feel like it's going to be more of an impact when he gets older.
Yeah, my mother was a special ed teacher for a long time, so I've grown up knowing a lot of kids with Down syndrome and autism and other kind of special needs situations. So, yeah, I love kids like that, and we've had some very close friends that were told with the blood test, the doctor said, "Okay, your results are in. The embryo has Down syndrome. So when would you like to schedule the abortion?"
Oh boy.
And they were just like, "Wait, say that again, but in 2 different sentences," like, not in the same sentence, and then, they're like, "Well, we're not gonna go that route," and come to find out it was a false positive. It's similar to your 3rd, child there, and so they just talk about that all the time. We were given that option when it was false information, but even if it was correct information, like, does that make that any better?
Yeah, I mean, we had much better doctor because when we had the false positive, well, that was the blood test and it's decently accurate, but you could do an amniocentesis, probably pronounced that wrong, but there's a little bit of risk to the child though with that one, and he was like, well, is the diagnosis going to change your plans at all? And we're like, no. So
Mm,
it's like, well, I wouldn't recommend you do it then
yeah.
because I guess it's just a different perspective, which I find alien. It's because I mean that was the hardest thing still in my life was preparing for maybe having a child who was only going to live a little while, and I don't know how you prepare for that, but at the same time, that's life. That's what everything's about. What are you living for exactly, other than this?
Circling back to the Babylon Bee, I know that this is one of the many hot topics that the bee has addressed because it is such a serious issue that you sort of have to expose the bad ideas that have led to these sorts of medical consultations that just take your breath away, and you have to sort of poke fun at it because every life is precious. I think back to my great great grandmother who came here all the way from Austria, Germany in the 1890s. She was one of 13 kids. And back then you had a lot of kids, first of all, because they valued children so much more than modern culture does. But then second of all, you didn't know how many of your kids would live. And so life was just so in the balance all the time. And it's like now we don't really value life, we value comfort.
Yeah, it's crazy, and I don't think people realize how big a problem that is because it's like you see in a lot of countries now where they're dying out because they're not having enough children, and I think a lot of that is just selfishness. It's like we think about ourselves, and it's like, well, how's this going to affect me? And I want this certain lifestyle, and it's just like you make such a small world for yourself, just thinking of your own wants. And especially with children with Down syndrome, because I think what is like Finland or something, they're almost bragging about how they basically eliminated Down syndrome in that country because every single one was aborted. And it's just, I mean, it's so sad. It's just they don't realize what they've lost, what they've taken away from themselves. And it's just, everybody thinks they have these nice, modern, civilized societies, and it's empty and hollow and it's for nothing. And if you're not for, if you don't really value life, because they like to think they do, but it's from you can see from the actions, not really. It's always about themselves in the end. And to me, that's one that always challenged both as a husband and especially as a father is learning not to just be about yourself. I guess that's something to explore a bit in Super Ego. It's like he's a psychopath, but can he actually care about other people? And in a way, we all have this journey to try to be more than just about ourselves. And as a Christian, it's not just thinking of others, but trying to be what you're supposed to be, what God wants you to be, and that's the ultimate journey.
Amen. Well, Frank, where can our listeners find you online?
Twitter's my I'd say my choice of poison in social media. I try to be a bright spot myself and not be too down on there. You just search for Frank J. Fleming, you'll find me, though it's like IMAO_ is what I had to settle on as my handle. And then you can go to frankjfleming.com, link my books there, link to my Twitter, also my newsletter if you want to sign up for book updates.
And as I understand it, you're writing a third book in the Superego series right now.
Yeah, so I wrote the first Superego. I thought I left the ending ambiguous. I wasn't sure we were going to do a sequel, but it wasn't ambiguous. Everybody was asking about a sequel. But I put that off for a bit. So it's like 5 years later, I finally put out Superego Fathom. It's my fourth novel. Now it's like I want to kind of make up for that. I'm trying to get the next ones. I think there'll be 4 books for the entire story arc. I'm written most of the third one so far, and I think my plan is I might do a sequel to Hellbender and then write the fourth one to Superego.
Very good. Well, Frank, thanks for coming on the show today. It was great to have you, and we'll see you around on Twitter and elsewhere.
Okay, thanks so much for having me.
Zach, that was great. I'm really glad you got to talk with him, even if I was tied up with things related to moving and book releasing and buying a fridge and vainly seeking bookshelves at IKEA. Listeners, if you have a favorite Babylon Bee headline or another work of fantastical satire that helped you see yourself or the world, this crazy world, in a different light, let us know. You can post a comment on our website, lorehaven.com/podcast, the page for this episode. We have a feedback form down there. Or if you've got an email software handy, just send us a note at podcast@lorehaven.com. Of course, you can always tag us on Twitter @Lorehaven or on the Facebook page @Lorehaven Mag.
And we're going to do another regional shout out today. We have a number of listeners in the UK. Myself, I've been to England several times, and so that's always a special place for us to go back to. But if you are a listener in the UK, please send us a message. Tell us, how did you first discover fantastical stories? Or what's something from one of our episodes that's resonated with you? Or this question that Stephen just asked. We'd love to hear from you. podcast@lorehaven.com.
Next on Fantastical Truth, I have mentioned the book. I shall be mentioning it again because my first book, a nonfiction project with co-authors Ted Turneau and Jared Moore, releases for real from New Growth Press on September the 7th, 2020. Just a couple of weeks away as we record this, and we will feature a 2-part episode exploring some key themes from this book, The Pop Culture Parent, helping kids engage their world for Christ. In that first episode, we will ask, what if popular culture was actually God's idea all along, and contrast that question, which not a lot of people ask about the purpose of popular culture, with some of the overreactions that Christians can have, either assuming that popular culture is mostly bad or mostly good, or we just throw up our hands and go, it's neutral. If you've listened to this podcast long enough, we are so strict. We're such legalists. We actually don't think there's a whole lot of room for neutrality. We would like to explore this question from a biblical vantage. We invite you to join in for this very important conversation. Meanwhile, if you're laughing at your world, keep it in good nature. Make sure especially that you're practicing biblical humility by laughing at yourself as God intended, but also in a good nature. Open your eyes and see the comedy in the world that God has made, and in particularly the failings of humans, even as we continue to seek and find fantastical truth.